website was started internally, but then we opened it up, and we have teachers from across our association sending in resources that they think are working. We have an internal review board that is now like a subcommittee reviewing all these activities that have been sent in, lessons to do that are sort of hybrid. A lot of them you can do, from home with found materials and keep the kids engaged at the elementary, middle, and high school level. So that's probably one of the biggest resources that we have out there and things we've been working on. And then obviously moving from our face-to-face conference, which was supposed to be the third week in March in Denver, is now going to be 100% virtual, and moving that into the virtual environment. The other part is we have that curriculum that's out there called Engineering by Design, and that used to all be face-to-face training, professional development and learning, and all of that has been transformed to be virtual now. So in less than a year, all that's happened, and it feels like a whirlwind because it is a whirlwind. I'll put some of those links in the chat if people want them, like the open access resources and stuff. And
Wonderful.
Everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. So Geraldine, let's talk about ASCE and what has happened with your organization. Just describe it a little bit, and how have you evolved during the pandemic?
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. So ASCE has experienced, pretty much, everything that everyone else has experienced out there. We had to shift greatly over the year. And so as teachers and students and parents have had to pivot, we had to pivot. So what we did was we, in that kind of quick turnaround, we established an online group for P12 educators and parents. And in this group, we provided daily challenges to help teachers supplement their lessons. And, and also if parents just needed something to, keep their children busy, they could also do this. We made it so that it was something that was accessible. You didn't need any expensive kits or anything to do it. It was using things you can find around the house or outside the house. And it really proved to be really successful because the teachers also had access to industry engineers, faculty members who are also a part of our membership. And so they were able to ask questions and get answers in real time to get support that they might need in order to make this quick change they had to online learning. And so it worked out really well. And they really enjoyed having that opportunity to interface with professionals on a daily basis. And so we did that on the onset of the pandemic. Also, we have our Engineering Go For It website, which has lessons and activities and articles that teachers can use in their classroom to supplement their lessons as well. So we were able to get things running pretty quickly because we saw the need. And so we were not able to do our P12 workshop that we typically do with our annual conference. As Steve mentioned, our conference had to go online. But this year, we are also planning to do our P12 workshop virtually so that it's accessible to anyone across the country. So those are some of the things that we're doing in order to support teachers.
Great. Well, thank you. And David, let's turn it over to NCTM. I know you had that 100 days going and you've had a lot of activities there. So let's talk about what NCTM has done and how have you evolved during the pandemic?
That's great. Thanks, Kelly. That's right. In fact, I was at Steve's conference at the ITEA. That is the last public event that I attended. And just a few weeks later, we were supposed to have our centennial annual meeting in Chicago, and that got shut down. NCTM quickly went to offering 100 days of professional learning that started April 1st and ran through October, working to support and address the challenges that teachers were having. What came out of that is really what we probably knew is that NCTM is really a community of teachers. And where we pushed was to say, how do we build and support that community? Doing the 100 days really provided an environment for teachers to come together and network and talk and share. And so as that progressed through the summer, There was work on moving forward and decision-making in the summer, getting back to school, equity and empowerment resources, all of those types of things to think about sort of key issues. But where we came to, or what we ended up doing was also doing some virtual conferences. And we've had probably over 6,000 people attend our conferences. We've had one in November and February. And being able to find opportunities for the community to come together. It was really clear that people didn't want to sit and just watch talking heads, but it needed to be interactive, and finding ways to get people to engage, discuss, connect, and be rejuvenated, because it's, the isolation that teachers are feeling, I think, is even worse now. And we need to use this platform to be able to bring them together. So we're continuing to work on that as we look to the spring, and trying to think about what are the challenges moving forward and how we can support them in those ways.
Well, thank you for that. I want to shift gears a little bit. And first of all, I want to say is that each of these organizations that they represent have enormous resources. So I encourage you to go to their websites, take a look at that, and also follow them on Twitter, their organizations as well as their individuals. Christina is probably one of the best people that tweets out there that I know of. So she's a great person to follow if you really want to keep engaged in terms of what's going on a daily basis there. So I want to shift gears as we talk about, we're focused on this integrated STEM, but each of you represent a letter in the S, T, E, and M. And, I look at your backgrounds and you see the science and the technology, the math, the engineering, you see all these components there. But how have you collaborated to focus more on integrated STEM? And I think with this question here, I'm going to start with Steve.
All right, thanks. So internally, we started to focus very quickly from a collaboration perspective, our internal groups. After March 12th hit and things were happening, we decided where are our strengths, and we were in the process of finishing up the Standards for Technological and Engineering Literacy update. And with that project, it was released in July. We knew that we had to put together our actions with those standards to make things come about. So our 4 councils, we have an elementary council, a higher ed council, a supervision and leadership council, and a collegiate student council. We had them take a look at that paper called STEM to the Fourth Power, the Power of Collaboration for Change. And we took that STEM 4 paper and those 3 principles that we're sort of using as a guide for integrated STEM. And we tried to put action items from the STEL, the Standards for Technological and Engineering Literacy, and define the role of T&E and STEM internally. And then we asked each of our councils to go out and start to work with different groups to do that. So for instance, we have our Council on Technology and Engineering Teacher Education, the Higher Ed Council, working right now with Carrie Snyder and Mihir Ravel, and the book that they put through with NSTA to try to see how that formative assessment component that they did their webinar on is connecting with the STEL, and how does all that work? So it's not in isolation. So that's one of the collaboration specific activities that I was recently involved in. And then a couple other things, the whole idea of integrated STEM doesn't happen in a vacuum. So there has to be open communication. And we've been encouraging, when we have our engineering by design workshops, it used to be we just have the technology and engineering teachers come, and that's the way it was. Now we're asking them to bring a science teacher and a math teacher with them. It's all virtual, so there isn't a lot of cost in the travel and things like that. And I would say, it's not 100% that it's working out that way, but there is definitely a better effort in terms of that collaboration. So we're sort of trying to take that pendulum and pull it over a little bit and get people to sort of reach out and talk with their colleagues about ways that they can start doing some of the hybrid stuff as well as face-to-face components that way in collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's jump over to David. And, David, you were part of that vision there as we started to think about what is integrated STEM and how do we start to all kind of come together. So how has this changed? How is this focused for you and what are you doing?
So one is it's about this collaboration is really about building community and networking. I think, and I really appreciate Steve and ITEA's work on putting this integrated STEM idea together. And it's one that I work with, so sometimes I think about it as a tetrahedron. So it's just sort of 4 nodes with an S, the T, and an E and the M. And yeah, we have to focus in each of those places, but integrated STEM happens in the spaces between those. And that's one of the places that I think we have been working, or I have been working. It's about building networks and helping math teachers and math think about we're part of STEM and we need to collaborate and talk and share. I don't want to steal Chris's thunder, but we have actually been doing some collaboration pieces. For one is NSTA did a STEM virtual forum. And since we were sort of locked at home, I got my daughter, who's in high school, to do a couple sessions with me that were on integrating science and math. And that was sort of a great experience to come in and talk about that and engage in those types of things and sort of taking those risks. We also have been looking at sort of STEM and literature. Chris and our president and a number of other people worked with the STEM Teacher Leadership Network to put together a blog and a panel to try to bring people in to think about how do you use literature, which many, at least at the elementary and middle school levels, teachers are familiar with, to think about getting into math and science and STEM activities and building those identity and agency so kids see themselves or can see others that look like themselves doing STEM. So with that, it is really about trying to connect and take opportunities and find ways to work together to do more with less, so that we're working together to do math and science and technology and engineering and literature with less time rather than with more time.
Wonderful. Thank you for David. And I think, you're touching upon how to draw those connections there. And that leads over, I'm going to start with you, Geraldine, on this, is that, again, you represent this letter in STEM. And I think sometimes engineering can be one of the most challenging for schools because, yes, you have a math class, you have a science class there, but then engineering, how do I bring that design methodology? How do I bring all of this together? Because that always sounds a little bit more scary too. So how have you collaborated to focus on integrated STEM?
Yeah, so it's funny, Kelly, when you first started about the backgrounds, because I joke around sometimes and say I'm almost integrated STEM by myself. I've studied the math, I've studied engineering, I've studied technology, I'm just missing the science. So I guess I should get that included. But one of the ways at ASCE that we recognize that engineering is a natural integrator of the S, the T, and the M. And so, it's important that when we discuss engineering challenges that we introduce the application of that when science and math and technology. And so we have recently launched a webinar series. I'll just skip to that. Next week, we will be discussing about racial equity and STEM education. And so on this panel, we have representatives from science, from technology, and from math. And in that panel, we will talk about how these subjects together work and within engineering, because a lot of what happens is teachers hear about engineering and like, I can't teach that, I don't know what that is. And that's because they don't see the connection. And so it's helping teachers to see that there is a connection, that you can talk about engineering intelligently, not to be afraid of it. If we're able to show them that there is a connection with the math, you can use an engineering challenge to talk about math, to talk about the science. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to drive home within ASCE, is that you don't have to look at engineering as this foreign thing. that it's connected with what you're already doing. It's just that you have to know how to bring it in. And so that's where we step in and try to help make that happen through sessions like the webinar, through the resources that we have. I had mentioned Engineering Go For It, which is our magazine and website newsletter, and using those resources to show that engineering is not this far off thing that you should only be talking about in high school. And talk about it in elementary school. We can talk about it in middle school too. And we're here to help you figure out what that looks like. And so again, that's where the piece of connecting the teachers to engineering faculty, engineering professionals, and helping them to bring that together. So I didn't get to talk a lot about what ASCE is before, but it's predominantly a collegiate organization, as most of our members are faculty and deans, and then we also have a P12 sector. And so that's one of the unique things about ASCE is kind of that access to professionals that can go talk through it with teachers and help them in that way. So as we continue to build this webinar series and continue to build on the resources and get feedback from teachers, then we will know and have a better idea of what else we can do to support them.
Great, thank you for that. Christine, let's just talk about, oftentimes when people associate STEM, they automatically think science. And I think what's the beauty here is that we're now starting to really see these connections, that it's not just about science, it's so much more than that. So why don't you talk about how this focus of integrated STEM?
I think it is interesting because as an individual who's a science teacher first, that's what you tend to first go through as a math teacher says math, but it is really integrated. And just even thinking about any topic that's happening today with COVID or the Mars rover landing, it's not just one field. So I think the students end up starting to see that. They have to integrate all of the different subject areas, but know about each individual subject area as well. So there's still content, but that integration is what really makes everything happen as we go through it. You were talking about some of the other initiatives. I know one of the projects I've been involved in that the National Science Teaching Association spearheaded was an integrative grant through the Department of Defense, DSEC. And there were collaborators from ITEA, ASEE, from Dave was involved with the math. And that focused on some more of the children's literature being used to help elementary teachers figure out how to integrate STEM, not only in their classroom within the STEM fields, but start to use some of the ELA components, because that was one of those ways that they could bring it in. So they were looking for books. Overall, I really think when we start to look for that integrative STEM, it's know your own subject, learn about everybody else's, but realize together, everything actually is how the world works, and it's a stronger connection.
Well, thank you all for that. I think as we think about it, and I love that you talk about integrated STEM, it's not just the science, technology, engineering, and math. It's also the literacy, the social studies, the art, everything that kind of pulls it together so that the students start to look at the classroom as being part of the real world. And how do I have that same inquiry when I'm studying those subjects? How do I take that inquiry and look at my local community and apply that? So it's something that, yes, we can talk about, but there's challenges that we face with this, and it's not necessarily an easy task to do. So, schools are faced with those challenges. How do we overcome this? How do we think about this? And what information do you have for our participants today to really think about overcoming those challenges? So David, I'm going to start with you on that question. Oh, Dave's on mute.
Yes, got it. I'm there.
Okay.
So it's not a small challenge. Let's just start there. It really is a significant challenge. And in mathematics, I think, there's some big questions that front this challenge of what we should be doing. And I'm going to talk about math and then about integrated STEM. So one of the questions is like, why learn math? Why do math? And we've laid out three core ideas. The first one is to make sense of their world, right? You've probably seen more graphs in the last 12 months than ever before in your life, right? And we see numbers on the screen every day. So how do we make sense of that? That's core for students. Math is one of those tools. The next piece is increasing their opportunities, not limiting them. So as we're teaching and thinking about teaching students, we're not putting in practices that limit what they could do. And the last piece is about joy, wonder, and beauty, but that's really about identity and agency. Creating students that see themselves as being able to do and apply mathematics. That is really central in the STEM ecosystem. Mathematics, if you aren't able to do mathematics, that influences what opportunities come to you later. So we need students that see themselves about doing that, being able to do that, see themselves as active in that, and as a doer of math, and then as science and technology and engineering. When we get into the teaching part, the other challenge is really sort of time and isolation and pressure. We know what works, and what works is engaging students. Engagement isn't necessarily fun, but it's actually talking about what's happening in their head. Are they thinking about what makes the sense making? Are they talking about it? Are they critiquing that with others? And that tool is, while it's powerful in mathematics, is also powerful in science and engineering and technology. And from a teacher side, it really is about this connection and collaboration. If we can step back and say, and in math, we're talking about purge and merge, right? What is the content kids really need to understand? Can we get rid of some of that? And can we teach other pieces in a more of a connected way? That actually works in STEM. So is there collaboration with other teachers, other content areas, so that we're doing science and math, or technology and math, or engineering and math, to build on and build our understanding and apply it so that 1 + 1 = 3. We're getting both the science learning and the math learning in an engaging way. And to me, that's at the core of integrated STEM. The challenge is, with all the pressures, finding time to do it and spaces to do it. But this Zoom technology and things, I think, provide some other opportunities to make and sustain some of those connections.
Thank you. And I'm going to jump this over to Steve, because I want you to talk a little bit about the technology piece of it too. I mean, that's been a huge challenge for many students, and some of it has been internet connectivity, and other has been, oh my gosh, how do I use this technology? And so I think, the one thing with integrated STEM that we look at is that technology is beyond just the tool. There's so much more that it can be utilized for. And so I'd love for you to just talk about overcoming those challenges.
You bet. So the first thing I learned when we started into this whole doing things online and remote teaching and learning was that not only do students not have sometimes good internet, neither do the teachers. They end up having troubles connecting. So one of the things that I think we learned from this was you need to have a backup plan. You need to think through all the things that could possibly go wrong logistically, and then try to create some safety nets, some plan Bs. And that helps when you're dealing with technology. I think that has to be an intentional thought that, you have a way that you might want to do it, but you might have to change. So from the technology of computers and the internet and the connections and the software and the hardware, the one plan that we've had is, let's see if we can create multiple scenarios to occur with multiple tools. So for instance, when school districts started giving laptops and notebooks to all their students, a lot of them were Chromebooks. A lot of the engineering software doesn't work in a Chromebook environment, but we found some opportunities like Onshape and some others that you can do computer-aided drafting and design on and things like that. So we started working down that road. But from a technological perspective, I think the idea of knowing how systems work, how they correspond and work together in that system, so there's an input, a process, an output, and a feedback loop. It's having students understand that, and the teachers too, so that they can problem solve together. And oftentimes it may not be exactly what you started out and intended to do, but with a collaborative approach with the students, with the teachers, it ends up in a result that the sum of the takeaway is actually greater from understanding that the environment that they had to deal with needed to be adjusted. Those human inputs were there, the technological inputs were there. I just lost my microphone, sorry. And I was talking with my hands, I knocked it over. So anyhow, part of the technology. But that whole process, I think, of learning about systems and how they operate, those inputs, processes, output, feedback, components, and seeing the world around them and being able to make it better for what they're doing is really about the technology and helping people. We have, I just want to share one quick thing that happened this year. We started last year this thing called the Reach Challenge. And the Reach Challenge is our students at the middle school, high school, and collegiate level creating adaptive assistive technologies for somebody in their community. And last year it went over fairly well. And we thought, oh, this year it'll just blow it out, right? Well, with COVID and everything being remote, it was very hard. But we had pretty good participation this year, but it was very different because of the environment that we were in. But they were able to create technological devices to assist people in their community with all sorts of different challenges that they had. So it can happen. Thanks.
Thank you. Christine, so, especially right now, I mean, thinking just along the lines of science alone, I mean, that has been a challenge in itself, but now we start to think about integrated STEM. And so talk about that, how can schools overcome this? I mean, you're at a university. You talked about how you set up breakout rooms, how you make it so interactive. We'd love to hear more about that, and then suggestions even at that K-12 level.
So I think Steve had a very important point when he said, whatever is being done has to be intentional. We can't just go into, here's a tool, let's use it. Ultimately, it comes back to a key premise based on an article called from David Merrill about the first principles of designing instruction. And it comes back to the teacher and it says, information alone is not instruction. So that intentionality of how we do things, whether it's my students who are going to be teachers or K-12, you have to make intentional decisions about what is the developmental level and how are you going to adapt and what they can do. They might be able to draw something and create a model and then discuss that among themselves. And using tools like Jamboard or Miro or all of these other kinds of interactive tools, the kids might be physically distant, but they can be collaborating on a single document, which allows them to have that discussion, which allows them to share those ideas. I think as we go on, using some problem-based or project-based learning is going to be helpful because it comes back to that real-world context. Students want to connect it to something. So even making connections around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are great topics. We heard before Dave mentioned about coming back to it has to be a local context as well. Well, pick a topic and how is that addressed locally? So Steve mentioned the kids were designing adaptive devices. I think that creates that interest in an engagement while they're still learning concepts. It might not be the traditional approach that we've used, but by integrating and using those local problems, they're going to be more interested and more engaged and still learning their own subject, as well as the importance of that cross connection to those subjects.
And Geraldine, to kind of shift over to you to play off exactly what Christine was talking about. I mean, it's that shift, it's that mind shift as well. So talk about how overcoming those challenges and especially thinking about it through that lens of engineering.
Yeah, so a lot of the challenges and solutions have been addressed by my colleagues. And I think really, especially when it gets to engineering, it's sometimes not even a thought. So just even getting to the integrated part of that, it's not even a thought on a teacher's mind of bringing that topic into the classroom. And then when you have the teachers who may want to, they lack some major resources, and two of those major things, money and time, right, to really do some of the things that they want to do in the classroom. And so, one of the things that ASE does in terms of supporting teachers we can't give you time, but perhaps we can provide some funding. And so that's something that the division, our pre-college engineering education division, does, is it supports teachers each year to either one teacher or a team of teachers, collaborative team of teachers on a engineering or STEM project. And so that is one way that, we try to help teachers in that way. Another challenge is the confidence level of teachers to be able to talk about engineering in the class in an integrated way. I've heard many times, I don't feel comfortable talking about that subject. It's hard. I don't know anything about engineering. I know science. I know math. I don't know what to even talk about. And so once you get into that with teachers, if they're not confident, that's also going to flow into their students, right? Because they're looking up to them as, okay, you know what to do, how to do this. And that lack of confidence, again, goes over into the students. And so what we encourage also is teacher professional development programs, especially in engineering, that support teachers in that way. Not the one-off type of thing, because we've learned over time that can help for a short period of time, but the sustainability of that is not necessarily there. There needs to be something that is over a length of time, that's continuous, that is supporting the teacher and being able to touch on these subjects, especially engineering in class, and knowing how to bring and connect the science, the math, the technology, and engineering together in solving a problem in class. And as was mentioned by Christine, Steve, and Dave, is that kind of relatable factor. That definitely helps. Even, I can tell you, even as an adult, that relativeness of the problem means a lot in how I understand the concept. So I definitely know that is helpful on the pre-K-12 level. And again, just to reiterate, the community problem, the problem even in the school of how they can solve that. I, taught an entrepreneurship class for some middle school kids, and they had to think of a problem that was going on in their school and how they would tackle that. And so the question was, I don't like what we get for school lunch. I wish there was a way that we could influence that. We could come up with a device to inform the school on, if they, on the different choices that we would like. And if there's a way that could be, get to the kitchen, and, it may not happen in real life, but it's the creativity of it, right? They're thinking about a problem that affects them. They don't like their school lunch. That's relevant for them. And so they went through this process of trying to figure out, how am I going to solve this problem that, me and other students in the school care about? So, it's bringing that relatable factor. And I think that's very important. And also the inclusivity. We talk a lot about, technology and having access to technology, and everyone doesn't have that. And so those students who don't have that access, unfortunately, get left behind. And so how do we level the playing field? And, the only way to do it is, unless we're going to provide every child with a laptop, with a tablet for the rest of their life. And there are some countries that do that. We haven't gotten to that level here in the US yet. But if we're not going to be able to do that, then how are we actually going to be able to make sure that everybody's getting equal access to this information and knowing how to solve these problems? And so that's why another thing is also touching on, you can learn engineering with the things in your house, in your backyard, your neighborhood. You can go for a walk, it's there. So it's learning how to identify it in your surroundings as well. And I think that also has to be taught to the teachers, and then that can go to the students. So it's helping the teachers to understand that.
Thank you, Geraldine, because I think this leads really nicely into the next question that I want to ask. You talk about these examples, and this is wonderful here. And I think there's been a lot of questions, even that talk about, I'm a science teacher or I'm a STEM educator, but, how do I build that collaboration? How do I start to work with the other teachers? I mean, the whole premise of integrated STEM is that it's not to be done in a silo, right? It's about breaking down the silos, drawing those connections, and not just within science and technology, engineering and math, but the literacy, the art, the social studies, all of the subjects, and having that ability to bring them together. So where does one person start? You know, if I'm a STEM teacher in a middle school, or I'm a science educator or a math teacher, but I really want to change this, where do you start? What do you do? And so I'm going to start that question with you, Christine.
So I think it begins with just even looking at your own curriculum and starting to make those connections wherever and whenever possible. Bringing in current events or topics associated with the other subjects that might not be in your class to truly start to integrate. I think elementary teachers and I think middle school teachers have the best option because they work on teams, they have pairs or they're self-contained. And if we get all elementary and middle school teachers starting to do this integrated STEM, I think the kids will get so used to it and accustomed to it that they will start voicing their desire for that to happen at the high school and start to make that change. Because the students see the connections, they see the relevance. They play video games, that's STEM right there. They start to do a variety of different topics where they're engaged in sports. We can apply STEM there. So I think ultimately, if we could start it young, they start to see it. It's a mind shift difference. They'll start to ask for it at the high school level. I noticed Tanner's point in the chat box right before I started to speak about seeing 4 silos on the screen right now. And unfortunately, yes, because we're all separated, all 5 of us are in different areas. But those conversations that happen, I think, external to a webinar or just through chats or when we all are together, and I'm so looking forward to that day again, I think that's where you start to really build some collaboration. The majority of us were all in the Philippines for a conference, and we collaborated by phone before we got there and then sat and started to work. So I think that conversation around it and then engaging the students so they're expecting that integration to occur is one of the key ways.
Well, thank you. And thank you for Christine to also address that question. I think, Steve, maybe if you go and you could talk to us a little about those, the 3 principles around integrated STEM, just highlighting those, because I think that also leads to a lot of how, you know, a STEM educator can also start to think about how do they build those connections within their school.
Right. So what that question by Tanner actually made me start to think of was Dave Geraldine, the first time down in the Lowe's Portofino, and we were doing an integrated activity together that was based off the Teams activity that Tanner and a few others like Greg Sturmel designed for a competition the year before. And I talked to TSA about Technology Student Association about using that context in this activity that we did. But what we found out very quickly was that it takes a ton of communication up front and delivering it to make sure that it connects with the audience, whether they're adults or whether they're students. So in an integrated concept, it really takes a lot of planning, but it was that heat gun activity with the thermal conductor that was in it. And it was a pretty cool activity. But with that being said, the 3 principles that Kelly is referring to are in the STEM to the 4th power. I put the link in the chat window. The first one is really interesting because this whole notion about silos is a tough one because there still has to be content, skills, and assessments that are foundational in each of the different areas of all the disciplines. Doesn't matter if it's S, T, E, and M, no matter what the discipline, there are some core foundational skill sets and knowledge bases that must be known there. And what we have to do is understand that that has to take place, provide time for it, and actually condone it. Like it needs to happen. So once that is identifiable and you provide that time, and it's not bad to teach in a silo sometimes, then it moves on to that second principle, and that is to try to find, and I saw it in the comments in the chat, the authentic components that integrate. and coming up with real world challenges in a design brief kind of mode that identify that it connects with the students, those kinds of integrated activities. But moreover, we have to allow time for planning to happen in a way that actually helps connect all those areas, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, with the literacy component and the overall problem solving skills, so that students start to see that these lines can blur and move back and forth, and understanding, the natural known world with the scientific approach, and being able to take that mathematical modeling component and pulling it in is important when we're designing solutions to engineering problems. So I think that's really important. The third principle, oftentimes, and I always call it as the third principle, and I really should start out with it up front, and that is connecting careers all the way through, so that with a diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of approach, not all times are students given the ability to understand what careers are possible, all the way through, from pre-K all the way through 12th grade. And it's really important for educators, all educators at all levels, to make sure that careers are integrated upfront across the board. And then the value add that I think we have to think about from that perspective is try to engage students to think about and identify what careers are not there now that you're seeing on the horizon that might be careers down the road. And then start to use examples of the last 15 to 20 years of all the fields that are out there, that all these new careers are there that weren't there 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that third principle is connecting those careers in a way that makes sense from a past perspective, a current perspective, and what will happen in the future with careers, and have them, the students, seeing themselves in those roles. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you going through that, because I think it really provides that grounding in the premise of how we're trying to draw those connections. And Geraldine, this leads to you, because when I think about K-12 and talking with teachers, a lot of times they don't necessarily understand what is an engineer. And so they can give kind of a classic definition of it, but how does that really become involved? So if you're thinking about it through, whether it's the lens of STEM and starting with science there, and I'm starting to build this out, I mean, there's a lot of programs and activities, but oftentimes those occur in isolation. So how, from your lens, from your perspective with ASEE, how can a teacher, how can they really embrace this to have it spread across, not just within a science or not just an after-school program or a specialty program within the school, but really being a connector? How does someone do that? How do they get excited and passionate and spread the word throughout the school?
Well, that's always been a huge task, right? So first we have to get them, as you mentioned, to know what engineering is, right? To understand it. So that's the first step. And what we do is we connect teachers with engineers, different types of engineers, right? So that you get away from the myth of the engineers, the train conductor or, mechanic. And, that's typically what people think of when they think of engineer, but there's so many disciplines within that, right? Being biomedical, electrical, mechanical, aeronautical. Engineering touches every facet of society. So understanding that premise is what will help, teachers in understanding how to connect that with their lessons. And then also connecting them with people who are in the field. They can come in as speakers for the class, or again, as I mentioned, we have this Engineering Go For It site that has subject matter experts that talk about the different disciplines. We have these nice cute graphics that talk about each discipline of engineering. We also worked with in NBC Learn and Discovering You series that had these videos interviewing different types of engineers from diverse backgrounds. And then there were associated lesson plans based on that person's discipline of engineering. So that's, ways of introducing it in a fun, interactive way. So also bringing in the diversity and equity and inclusion part of it is that, you're seeing engineers. It's not just the typical, and, even speaking from my experience as a Black woman in engineering, you're not just seeing, just one type of person as an engineer, that you're seeing that engineers come in all, shapes and forms. So it's breaking a lot of those myths down. And then also being able to have access to the tools that will also then be able to assist the teachers in breaking down those barriers for the students as well. So that's why I mentioned that video series, which, students could go home and look at that themselves too and say, I see myself there and I could be an engineer too. So I think that's really important in providing those type of resources for teachers. And then, as I mentioned, them understanding what that is, because if they have a misunderstanding, they're going to share that misunderstanding with the students, and it keeps perpetuating itself. Again, I mentioned the teacher professional development programs and how important that is. I will also mention we recently collaborated with AE3 to produce an engineering learning framework. And so that also will help teachers in understanding, okay, well, what does this look like in the classroom? And when they are able to see that and have this kind of framework to go by, they say, okay, well, this is what engineering is, this is what it's not. So I think that's what really will help them in understanding and incorporating this engineering in their lesson plans, in the science teacher in their plans, the math teacher in their plans. And then also you also need the buy-in of your school administrators too. Sometimes I, hear from teachers, I want to do these things, but I don't have support from my school to be able to do it. My principal, my vice principal, I don't have the time. So there also needs to be buy-in from the school as well, recognizing the importance of engineering, and not just waiting, for students waiting till high school or college to hear about engineering, and how important it is to address that now. And I know I'm talking about it because I'm passionate about it, because, a lot of, I hear all the time, I didn't even know that was an option for me, engineering, because no one ever talked to them about it until much later. Not to say everyone has to go in engineering, but at least it's an option on the buffet table, right? It's there. And if you're interested in it, you go for it. But some people don't even have that option on the table for them because they never heard about it. And that's because, the teacher didn't talk about it. No one in their family is an engineer. But that's, again, with the access and availability. Some students have that. I've taught an elementary school class, and we're students who, have parents who are engineers, and they know about blueprints at age 5. And then there's students who are 18, don't know what that is, but that's access. They have that accessible to them. And so it's really important to level the playing field for teachers, because just as we talk about access for teachers, access for students is access for teachers as well. That's really important, and it's just not equitable. So again, with the teacher professional development program, we just launched an endorsement program that kind of looks at development programs against a set of teacher professional development standards, so that if you are going to go through a program, that the program you're going through has, the right type of lessons, that they're in the principles and structure that you would need to then again impart that information on your students. So those are just some things. Sorry to go on and on about that, but it's, I'm passionate about it.
I know. I love that passion. We all do. And Dave, I think, just not even just with the engineering, but with the math, you face a couple different things. One, you have tests that you have to adhere to, right? So you have that kind of coming at you. Sometimes math, it's a lot of perseverance. The higher you go up in those grades and stuff, you've got to continue to stick with it. It builds upon each other. And so sometimes there can be a level of frustration with it. And oftentimes students don't necessarily, you talked about it earlier, it's like, why am I learning this? How am I ever going to use this in my future and stuff? So if I'm a math teacher in school, and I'm trying to draw all of these connections, but I know that I have this test that's going to be coming up, and I know my students are going to have to take this test. How do I still participate in this integrated STEM and not make it feel like it's, oh, great, I have more work, but really feel like, you know what? This is really embracing the work that I'm doing it and putting it in a real application for the students. So talk about that.
Okay, and what you say is true. I mean, there are lots of those constraints. On the other hand, what we do know is that when students are actually engaged in doing learning and thinking and building things, it's those connections that allow them to access their information. If you build understanding and fluency, which happens when kids are doing problem solving and applying their mathematics, then they have a richer and a deeper knowledge that serves them much longer. There's so many kids, and I'll say my kids are in that boat too, that's like, well, I knew how to do that once, but I have no idea how to access that information. And that happens in math class. But when you do integrated projects where the project, and that's the important piece, that sometimes math in STEM should be a grade level, right? It should be applying the concepts they're learning or recently applied, not concepts from 2 or 3 years ago, right? And finding ways to do those things and apply it and make sense of it in action is the important piece. What is always challenging, and we get into this sort of catching up, right? That the time you spend in engaging students in that is actually valuable because it solidifies stuff for students that you're not having to go back and drill for tests or doing other things later on. So it is working to bring those pieces in. The important part too, and I just want to say this, is that this should be an opportunity for every student. This shouldn't just be something that happens after school or in this special club. It should be every teacher in that grade and every grade across this where students are having these experiences. That's an equity issue, just like Geraldine said. We need to bring these opportunities to every teacher, every school, every district, and every student so that they have these quality learning instructions in math and in science and technology and engineering and the integration between them. That's how we generate the STEM professionals, the STEM leaders, and the STEM aware citizenry of the future.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think, and I love that we talked about this equity piece of it because it's so key and essential that this doesn't appear to be for one group of students. It's truly about all students. And it's truly about incorporating it through the entire day and making sure that students have these opportunities. I know we're really short on time, so I am just going to give each panelist 30 seconds because I want to jump back and just do a little summary at the end here. But I'm going to give you each 30 seconds just to kind of leave some lasting thoughts, whether you want to discuss about additional resources. Again, everybody go to the website, go to their pages, but just anything final that you'd like to say. And so let's just jump back. We're going to start with Steve on this.
All right, thanks, Kelly. This has been a great session. I've learned a lot listening. So I just want to mention that the idea or notion of having teachers teach in contexts that are meaningful to students is a real key. And in the standards that we released in July, you'll see the 8 core standards there surrounded by the engineering habits of mind with a making and doing flair. And then the ability for the octagons there to throw in a little bit of mathematical model there, the context, everything from computational thinking to agriculture and biological technologies, medical technologies, the built environment. We're leaving that wide open to the imagination of the educators to connect with students. So the standards must be taught, the practice is done, but they can be through any context. And that's the richness of the educator coming through with their experience and expertise.
Great, thank you for that. And don't forget, everyone, that their virtual conference is coming up March 24th to the 27th. So want to be a part of that. So Christine, I'm going to jump over to you. Your last thoughts in 30 seconds.
So I think the key here is focus on those real world concepts. And you were all encouraged, and I would encourage you as well, to go to any of the association pages and learn something. But challenge yourself, whether it's now, still in a pandemic, or when you get back to school, to go talk to teachers in those other areas and just start with, where can we make some connections and what might work in our curriculum? it's a whole new world with this pandemic, with virtual, and hopefully when we go back, we're going to have some newfound activities and newfound strategies to keep pushing students and the STEM subjects forward in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And Geraldine, let's switch it over to you.
Okay, so final comments. Until STEM, engineering, all of this is available and accessible to everyone, we can't achieve full success. So I, strongly believe that, that we've got to put more policies in place, make sure that everyone has access to what they need in order to have the same experience or close. I think that's very important. Also, as teachers are charged with teaching integrated STEM, to also just be aware of any biases, and be in the challenges and problems that we are asking students to solve, to think about, where the frame of mind that a student may be coming from. And if you're asking a problem or question that they just don't have any frame of reference to, that you could also be setting them up for failure. So just to be conscientious of how we frame our questions and our challenges to our students, and that everyone doesn't come from the same background.
That's so true. And I think it's, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because we do have to continue to push for this to ensure that it's for all, and that it's the only way we're going to have that common ground there. David, I'm going to allow you to kind of wrap it up with your 30 seconds there.
Okay, I'm not good at numbers, so. But what I want to say is that this group of people and the connections I make through STEM are one of the best things that's happened to me in the last decade. And what I would encourage you to do is make those connections. Find people in science and technology and engineering and math, and reach out to them and build those pieces, because where STEM happens is between those connections. And the other part is to share that information. And what I'll just tell you is that we have, this is the shameless plug, but we have a virtual annual meeting in April, but we also have conferences next year, and we're looking for proposals for people to speak about it. I would love to see STEM sessions at the math conference, so our teachers see more about how they can engage and interact and the role that they play as STEM professionals. Thank you, Kelly.
I just want to thank all of you. I mean, it's always such an honor. I find these conversations so incredibly engaging and exciting, and it re-energizes me every single time. And I think part of it is that you're all doing amazing work, but I love the synergy and the connections and the relationships that has built among you and with all of us together, and bringing in more and more people right here in the US, but also around the world, which is amazing. I do want to just mention to everyone that we are going to have our virtual STEM Leadership Alliance Summit. This year it's going to be the 13th and 14th. But by golly, by 2022, we all hope to be back together in Orlando, Florida, sharing all of this information and showcasing this magnificent work. So save those dates right now. We're looking at July 7th to the 14th, but we'll keep you posted on that. And we're going to continue these webinar series. But I also want to tell you, look at each one of these organizations. They have amazing resources, amazing connections. We also share them on the STEM Leadership Alliance website too. But I just want to say kudos to everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And, let's just keep taking this and pushing it, because the more that we can do, we cannot stop, because our children need this. So let's keep moving. So thank you all so, so much. All right. Have a great day, and we'll all be in connection with each other.
Thanks, Kelly.
All right.
Thanks all.
Thank you all for joining.